Hi, everyone. My name is Cole J. Graham, and I am addressing you today from a beautiful day in Columbus, Ohio, in the United States. I am a PhD student in the history of art here at The Ohio State University, and today I am excited to share with you my work in progress, Inefficient, Unsustainable, and Fragmentary, the Rauschenberg combines as disabled bodies. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen here. Perfect, there we go. So in February of 1960, MoMA curator William Rubin accused Robert Rauschenberg's combines of rendering the inherently biographical style of abstract expressionism almost embarrassingly private. Their exhibition in the gallery space, then, like pulling down your pants next to a Jackson Pollock, counts as an act of overexposure that has inspired decades of art historical discourse. The combines have variously been read as an insistence on the work of art as both in its environment and in communication with it, as an attempt at the redress due femininity and interiority, and relatedly as a refusal of heteronormative subjectivity in the Cold War era. I, however, am proposing we encounter Rauschenberg's combines through a lens of cultural critical disability theory that establishes disability as an always embodied category of human difference, similar to race, gender, or sexuality. Rauschenberg was not unfamiliar with the disabled experience. Just old enough to be caught up in the end of World War II, the artist received his draft notice in the spring of 1944. Having enlisted in the Navy Hospital Corps, he worked as a nurse attendant in San Diego, caring for men whose nerve damage made feeding themselves impossible. And though Rauschenberg himself was able bodied, near adulthood, his challenges in school would finally result in a dyslexia diagnosis. Evidence of this learning disability may exist in Souls, seen on screen here, a 1953 work, a whitewashed wooden box, spilling over with painted rocks and twine, completed shortly before Rauschenberg's turn to the combines. It is admittedly not impossible that Rauschenberg's strange title was intentional. When one thinks of souls, one thinks of shoes, thoughts which in turn engage those having to do with feet and perhaps even with self-propelling ambulation. I maintain, however, as did Walter Hopps, that the title was likely intended to be souls, Souls, of the spiritual and eternal kind, and that the misspelling was, at least initially, a result of Rauschenberg's reading difficulties. That the name remains an uncorrected word seems to me an indication of its incidental quality, meaning that if Rauschenberg later discovered the error, he attended to it by doing nothing, opting instead to integrate his mistake, one due to lack of ability, into the work's composition. This is a possibility that seems especially likely if one considers an earlier work with a related title, The Man with Two Souls. Constructed in 1950, the work's glass rod phallus rises from between two Vaseline glass wine jugs, the rounded kind that read either as balloons or, more to our point, balls. That this blatantly phallic, split self work came out of Rauschenberg's short-lived marriage to Susan Weil, while the production of Souls aligns temporally with his first meeting with Jasper John, suggests Rauschenberg may have been concerned with the split soul versus the whole one, as well as the act of two souls coming together. Today, John, with whom Rauschenberg shared a romantic sexual relationship for the next 6 years, retains souls in his private collection. Rauschenberg once told an interviewer that the purpose of a retrospective was not to encourage people to see old work in the light of the new, rather to see the new in the light of the old. The artist instructions are helpful, I think, in the suggestion that we might allow new meanings to inhabit and revitalize works through their relationships with the works and the work that came after. While the medical model was the sole model for disability discourse when Rauschenberg received his education and when he produced his combines, disabled people were simultaneously living into and insisting on their own subjectivities nonetheless, often in ways that implicitly rejected medicalism, containment, and social acceptability. Indeed, if Rauschenberg's combines knowingly engaged sexuality and gender difference as differences that make a difference, they just as pointedly anticipated discourses that would frame disability as another such mode of difference. That it requires a positionality rooted in current understandings of cultural critical theory to recognize this does not make the critique the combines offer any less biting. Rather, that this critique is so late in its arrival makes attending to the combines as existing corporeal bodies that redefine at the basis level what it means to function all the more urgent. The flatbed picture plane is at this point synonymous with Rauschenberg's work. When Leo Steinberg invoked the phrase, he was commenting on the then radical reorientation of a painting's intended positionality, taking the painting down from the wall where it hung vertically and instead laying it out horizontally. No longer was the picture plane a window, it was a workspace. Considering Rauschenberg's later silkscreens, Steinberg called on the ubiquity of the printing press as one familiar arena of interaction with the flatbed. While this made sense for the silkscreens, I would argue that the more immediate connotation of the flatbed as it pertains to the combines is the flatbed pallet or the flatbed truck, surfaces onto which items are loaded for transport. The combine as flatbed would therefore imply something like mobility in addition to positionality, though this locomotion would be enacted not by the flatbed, pallet, or picture plane itself, but through the arms of the forklift and the tires of the 18-wheeler. In other words, if we are going to rescue Steinberg's reading, we should do so in ways that come to bear on means of moving through and encountering the world. That is, ways that come to bear on the disabled mind-body. The first of these is to consider the flatbed picture plane as a compositional device directed toward the act of leveling. With its voraciousness, its lack of discrimination, its wandering attention, Rosalind Krauss writes, this leveling form of perception decrees that the magnet for all these elements will be the picture surface. While William Seitz refers to Rauschenberg's materials as urban refuse that has been subjected to an inversion from ugliness to beauty and has therefore become worthy of complete aesthetic acceptance. Looking at the combines, however, one must ask if any inversion of refuse has truly occurred. Is it not the refuse that refuses Seitz's inversion and subsumption? Take, for example, one of Rauschenberg's most oft-discussed combines, Monogram. The spare tire that encircles Rauschenberg's taxidermied goat was purchased from a local furniture store, and it is therefore literal refuse, trash taken straight out of the pile and attached to Steinberg's flatbed picture plate. And yet, in fixing the discarded tire around the similarly discarded goat's middle, Rauschenberg had treated his secondhand livestock with an excess of care. Though he may have initially haggled over the $15 price tag, in dedicating 4 years to its consideration, Rauschenberg's valuation restored dignity, always a slippery concept, but especially so within the nexus of disability, to his thrift store find. In the artist's hands, the goat became worthy of consideration. Rauschenberg further demonstrated this in carrying out intimate acts of care. He combed out the goat's matted coat and repaired its damaged face. While none of this indicates a complete aesthetic acceptance of the goat, it does speak of a certain demand for its recognition. In reference to another combine, Kickback of 1959, Carol Dunham reads a spray of black paint as a shit stain that evidences a total lack of sphincter control, a collapse of the most basic boundaries of the individual. Kickback's intimate embarrassment of this moment, when the most private bodily function becomes the most public in a laying low of the body's corporality, Dunham suggests, is tragicomic. And I think the same is true in the case of Monogram. Monogram's presence feels decidedly playful. Its picture plane resembles Rauschenberg's black paintings in its palette of tar and crude oil, evoking similar scatological associations. Well, near the goat's back end, a dirtied tennis ball, widely recognized as a reference to a Jasper Johns work and thus to Rauschenberg's sexuality, begs to be read as a turd. Here is the mark of the artist in its crudest and literally lowest form, the shit stain. Surely there is no complete aesthetic acceptance for the person publicly experiencing a total loss of sphincter control. In other words, the person who shits themselves. There is only, and instead, the dark humor necessary if one is to live with and in the public-private collapse of disability. If the loss of sphincter control is the comic element of Monogram, its tragic element is that the goat is dead. It will not, without Rauschenberg's help, be going anywhere. Not only glassy-eyed, its eyes are glass. We know this for two reasons. One is that the eye provides one of the earliest visible signs of decomposition. Between 2 and 5 hours after biological death, the cornea begins to cloud over as the breakdown of cells releases an excess of potassium. The second is the process of taxidermy itself. Our casual reference to the taxidermied animal as stuffed implies an association with the teddy bear, whose body is filled with the fluff that gives it shape before being lovingly stitched shut. The process of stuffing a goat, however, looks quite different. Coming from the Greek taxis, meaning arrangement, and dermis, meaning skin, the practice of taxidermy is, quite literally, the arrangement of skin. To break the process down to its essentials, the only part of Monogram's goat that is original to its body is its skin, which, having been removed, cleaned, and tanned for preservation, has been stretched over a goat-shaped frame. As it turns out, Monogram's goat is hardly a goat at all. It is, at best, the evidence of one. While Rauschenberg's taxidermied goat asks that we squirm in uncomfortable but ultimately humorous acknowledgement of our bodily functions, it thus simultaneously activates grim anxieties surrounding literal biological death. Not only its death, but our own, in the same way encountering a body in pain reminds us of our own susceptibility to pain. What is the edge of personhood? The goat's glass eyes ask. How much of the original body can be removed before who and what one is changes fundamentally? What must we retain if we are to retain ourselves? The 3D printed limb is one thing, but what of the proverbial science fiction head in a jar? It might be helpful here to consider the history of the word scapegoat. The word emerges this time not out of ancient Greece, but out of an attempted 16th century Protestant translation of the book of Leviticus. Within the Torah, the observance of Yom Kippur dictates the ritual slaughter of one of two goats, one for the glory of the Lord, and a second that, taking on the sins of the community as a whole, is pushed from a cliff. The botched Protestant translation allowing the second goat to escape, carrying away with it the community's sins. That is, the goat, a domesticated animal, was granted its freedom in the form of an exile from the herders who had previously safeguarded it. Therefore, it too was destined to die, in a way less grisly, but perhaps ultimately crueler than in an instantaneous drop into a rock-filled ravine. Even here, then, the scapegoat was marked as expendable. Surely, in ancient Greece, as today, chances of misfortune and death are not evenly distributed. Those relegated to the margins of society have the most trouble accessing such necessities of adequate food and drink and stable housing, leaving the visibly disabled, whether because they move differently or speak differently, to face high rates of illness, injury, suffering, and ultimately, like Rauschenberg's goat, death. Markers of humanity, good hygienes, homes, etc., were and still are themselves directly associated with and are in fact products of such resources. Put simply, signs of physical difference acted and continue to act as both markers of a lack of humanity and the cause of that lack. With its horizontal arrangement, monogram's potently flatbed nature not only demands we consider what constitutes undesired difference, it further jostles the assumed viewing positionalities of the bodies that interact with it. Steinberg speaks to the normal erect posture assumed by most painting from at least as early as the Renaissance. Hung on the wall, both the traditional easel painting and Pollock strip paintings are best viewed in a fully upright standing position that allows us to come face to face with the image, or so Steinberg asserts. This, however, is not so for the stuffed goat of monogram, who, situated well below our standing line of sight, placidly bears witness to the transformation of the visual surface into, as Rauschenberg called it, pasture. Yet, a preliminary sketch given to Jasper Johns reveals that Rauschenberg once considered arranging the combine vertically. In Rauschenberg's drawing, the goat projects sidelong from a rectangular vertical surface. Rather than below our standing line of sight, the placement of the latter suggests the goat might have hovered well above it. If Rauschenberg ever actually arranged monogram this way, however, there is no further documentation of the experiment. While the careful viewer can spot the goat taking up an array of positions in photographs of Rauschenberg's studio, this drawing in the Johns collection is the only remnant of this compositional possibility. What this tells us is that monogram's horizontality is no accident. Rauschenberg's goat did not stumble onto its pasture by chance. Monogram's arrangement, one knowingly chosen by the artist in full awareness of the alternatives, could easily have assumed the usual able-bodied standing viewer. Pointedly, though, it does not. In bringing all of this to a fine point, we find ourselves in the territory of the feminist theoretical framework of standpoint theory. Standpoint theory asks us to question what perspectives and what possible solutions come from encountering the world from atypical vantage points. Turning then to Steinbeck's flatbed picture plane, I would like to suggest a variation on standpoint theory, that is, sit point theory. Directed from the vantage point of repose, sit point theory would instruct us to sit and take stock of our bodies and minds, to, if just for a moment, take a load off and see what alternative ways of looking and seeing reveal themselves. The combines, Steinberg wrote, though they hung on the wall, kept referring back to the horizontals on which we walk and sit, work and sleep. In doing so, I believe they rejected assumptions about the body's ability and what is required for viewing subjectivity. When we consider that it was Jasper Johns who suggested Rauschenberg roll monogram's goat out to pasture, we may be tempted by connotations that evoke what we do to the very old and the no longer useful. These goats, those goats no longer capable of producing milk might, in the slight, seem at risk, especially in consideration of the scapegoat's fate. Sit point theory, however, would have us pause and consider whether the scapegoat on its placid pasture, and thus our bodies and minds during times of repose, might not only retain its dignity, but also radically interrogate understandings of value from the point of view of previously cast off subjects. Thank you all so much. I look forward to reading all of your questions.